It's been about 3 years since I've been here, and a lot of things have happened. In 2018, early 2018, our new book came out, our latest book came out. And it is arguably the best work that we've put out since 1975. Unfortunately, several months after the book came out, actually mid 2019, our publisher died. And then a month later, one of my co-authors died. Then, late last year, I was diagnosed with kidney cancer. I'm happy to say, praise God, I've been cancer-free since March 15th. It's been it's been quite an odyssey. Not to take too much time for that part of it, but I actually discovered the tumor. I had an itch on the side of me, and I felt, and when I did, there was a sizable lump there, and it took 2 different surgeries. The first surgery was a failure because of insufficient equipment at the hospital, but God's hand was so much in this. I got referred to the USC Medical Center, where I got both a doctor who was both nationally known and internationally known, and this was one of his specialties. 3.5 hours in surgery, and they got it all. They got it all. And Thursday of this week, I had my first post-op CT scan, and it came back totally clear. So, briefly about our work, we've been at this since 1975. And it started off with kind of an interesting conversation that I had with the man who was our project leader for at least the first book. We were at a party, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, he asked me, "Who do you think wrote the Book of Mormon?" And I thought, well, is he crazy? Everybody knows who wrote the Book of Mormon. It was Joseph Smith. And so that's what I told him. And he goes, "No. A guy named Solomon Spaulding wrote the Book of Mormon." And I said, "Seriously? Have you been smoking something?" And he goes, "Art, here, listen, sit down with me and let me tell you what I know." And so he went through everything that he knew at that time, including college professors who told him that Spaulding wrote the basis for the Book of Mormon. I was stunned and I was hooked. My curiosity got the better of me. In 1977, we came out with our first book that was made possible by Dr. Walter Martin. Some of you may know the name, founder of the modern counter-cult apologetics. The book was a runaway bestseller. It sold 750,000 copies in a little over 2 years. But it also started a real firestorm in the Mormon Church. We had death threats, we had bomb threats. The first print shop where the book was being printed was destroyed, so the printing had to be moved to a secret location. My friend Howard, his car was shot at one night on the freeway. When he got home, he found a bullet hole in the side of his Pinto from a .357 Magnum bullet. Had the bullet entered the car just 1 inch over, it would have gone right through the driver, and 2 of my co-authors would have been dead. This was before the first book even came out, okay? A few days later, the editor of the first book, in her front room, she saw something on the carpet. As she bent over, a bullet came through the front room window, lodged in the wall, .357 Magnum, same ballistics as the bullet that went into Howard's car. A few days later yet, one of Walter Martin's assistants had just left the gas station with a full tank in his car. He felt kind of a shock to the vehicle and heard a loud noise. He kept driving. When he got home and he walked around the back of his station wagon, he noticed a trail of liquid. It was gasoline. A .357 Magnum bullet went straight through his gas tank and embedded on a frame piece. Once again, same ballistics as the other two. Fortunately, all of that kind of stuff ended with the first book. So we don't need to worry about any crazies coming up and, at least I hope, and interrupting this thing. But as rapidly as the book gained popularity, it disappeared, and basically nothing until the early 90s. And I called up the guys and I said, look, there's still a lot of stuff unanswered. We need to go at it again. And so book number 2 came out in 2005, published by Concordia Publishing House. Yay. It took 3 attempts to get them to accept it, but it finally hit the right pastor who actually knew about Spalding. And so they published our second book, all 560-something pages of it. And it had a significant amount of material that the first book didn't have. It didn't sell as well, but with the fact that Concordia Publishing House published our book, it gave us phenomenal credibility in the Mormon community. Of course, they still said it was bogus and bunk and had been debunked, over 100 years earlier, but their first review of our book was 130 pages. Wow. Okay? All the while saying, oh, there's nothing to this. Well, I think you can say that in a lot less than 130 pages. And they've written, I think, no less than a half dozen other reviews of that first book. I think the last one came out like a year or so ago, and it was 40 or 50 pages. They just, But finally, on Facebook of all places, I met a wonderful man, Reverend Aaron Sims, who expressed interest in our book. He was an SMP pastor back east, and he also happened to own St. Polycarp Publishing, who published our book. And we were looking for a publisher because Concordia said, don't bring us any more books on Mormonism. I'll leave it at that. He was very excited, and he said, I love apologetics. I love your guys' work. Let's get this thing published. And he got a rather prominent historian to do the preface, which really helped. Unfortunately, as I said, several months, I think about 6 months, 8 months after our book came out, he passed away. And since the publishing company was solely his, when he passed, the company passed as well. But it is absolutely our best work because it has all the stuff that we've learned going all the way back to 1975. Plus, he accepted our pleas to come out with 2 different versions of the book. A paperback that would be an easy read for anybody. You could probably read the thing in a couple of days. That gives the gist of what we call the Spalding Enigma. And then for those hardcore people who wanted every doggone research note, book, letter, pamphlet, whatever that we used to get to this point, here it is. They charge by the pound. What both books have is a very detailed index, which is something that none of the previous books ever had. With that said, And I'm so happy to be here because it's been like 3 years since the last time, and I'm just so happy to be alive. So I'm going to fire this up, and we'll get into the actual presentation. Okay, so who really wrote the Book of Mormon? Well, from what I've said so far, obviously, Spalding. But let me clarify. Our claim is that he wrote the basis for the Book of Mormon. Did he write the Book of Mormon? No. But as you're going to see as we go through the different slides, that he very clearly wrote the basis for it. And he was aided by other people. Spalding was the original bad luck guy. He was a learned man. He was born in the 1760s. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He went to college, studied at Dartmouth. He studied law with a very prominent judge at that time. A few years later, after graduation, he became an ordained minister. His first assignment was as the principal of a school called the Cherry Valley Academy. He had to leave that because he had chronic back issues, possibly from the war. After that, he became a minister at a church. He left that. Same issues. The only thing that he ever truly succeeded at was a store that he ran with his brother. Had he stayed there, he might not have ever written Manuscript Found. Okay? But he left that. He got into land speculation, and his timing was phenomenal. When did he start buying land? 1809. What happened in 1812? People started defaulting on all their property, and the creditors came after him, and yeah. So he turned to writing. He thought, if there's anything I can do, I'm a learned man, I've got a vivid imagination, I love looking at the ancient burial mounds in my neighborhood, I'm going to write a history. He called it a romance, a historical romance. And it'll be about the American Indians. Now, something that was a belief that was very prevalent at the time was that the American Indians were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. We know that that's not the case, obviously, but at the time it was a very popular theory. Spalding bought it hook, line, and sinker, and he started writing. Well, he actually made two major novel attempts. The first one was called Manuscript Story, and he got about 130 some odd pages into it, and goes, okay, this just isn't going anywhere. And so around 1811, 1812, he started a second work called Manuscript Found, which was a huge book written in Elizabethan English, just like the King James Bible, okay? And he said something very chilling about it to his friends. He said, 100 years from now, my book is going to be looked at as if it were history. So he wrote the book. He took it to a publisher in Pittsburgh by the name of Patterson. And let's see, let's get into this. Okay. Here we go. So, oh yeah, I got to do this before I get to the actual bullet point.
Can you move forward a little bit? Yeah, the audio's not very good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, this book that Spalding was writing, Manuscript Found, had so many instances of the phrase come to pass, came to pass, it came to pass, thus it came to pass, when it came to pass, as it came to pass, that his friends and family all called him Old Come to Pass. And interestingly, the Book of Mormon has something like 16 times more instances of that phrase come to pass or came to pass than the King James Bible. Gee, I wonder where that came from. The Spalding Enigma. The Spalding Enigma is plainly this, that Spalding wrote a novel called Manuscript Found. He took it to a publisher. A man by the name of Sidney Rigdon grabbed it, stole it for a while, copied it, then a few years later got together with two other gentlemen, Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith. The three of them reworked it over a period of about 3 years, and what turned out was what we now call the Book of Mormon. This is the Spalding family's wedding photo. Obviously, it was before even daguerreotype or whatever. This is Spalding's daughter. Isn't she just a charmer? She's actually smiling. I think she had the axe underneath her skirt or something. Wonderful woman. Phenomenal supporter of her father, especially once everything broke loose about the Book of Mormon coming out. Okay, I mentioned Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, interesting fellow, brilliant man, biblical savant. He was a fiery, itinerant preacher. He started out as a Baptist. He got kicked out of the Baptist church. He then moved in with the Campbellites, and it looked like things were going pretty well with that. But then he started teaching his crazy doctrines, and so he got thrown out of the Campbellite movement as well. He's the guy who stole Spalding's manuscript. Oliver Cowdery, very interesting individual. He was born in 1806, I believe. Sidney Rigdon was born late 1700s. Oliver Cowdery was one of Joseph Smith's cousins. And even though the Book of Mormon came out in 1830, Oliver Cowdery was actually working with the Smith family as early as 1822, 1823. Joseph Smith, yes, that wonderful P.T. Barnum guy, charismatic leader of the Mormon Church. He came from a very interesting family. They were all into mysticism. His father was what they call a rodsman. He used a divining rod to look for anything from water to buried treasure. Of course, the buried treasure was never found. He was also into counterfeiting. He and a whole bunch of people, and they would escape over the border into Canada from upstate New York whenever things got hot. His mother, Lucy Mack Smith, she was very much into folk medicine and kind of the mystical side of religion, and she was certain that one of her sons was going to become a famous prophet. Joseph Smith was actually second choice. Joseph's older brother, Alvin, was to be the prophet, but he died under some kind of cloudy circumstances, and so then Mother Smith said, "Okay, Joe, you're it." And so what's very important to know is that the Book of Mormon and Mormonism could not have come into being without all three of these men. Each one of them brought unique gifts, if you want to call it that, unique abilities to Mormonism, okay? Joseph Smith, obviously the charismatic leader, needed somebody like him to do what he needed to do in order to sell Mormonism, okay? Oliver Cowdery, journeyman printer, tinsmith, peddler of books, backwoods lawyer. He wrote the first complete copy, what they call the printer's copy of the Book of Mormon. So he was necessary from that standpoint. And then Sidney Rigdon. Nobody had the preaching chops like Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon had this, to call him narcissistic, I guess, would be perhaps an understatement. But he thought he was going to be the Apostle Paul to the New World. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Okay, now this guy, Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. That's a mouthful. Doctor was actually his first name. Okay? He was the seventh son. There was something going on about the seventh son. They wanted to give him a special name, so the Mr. and Mrs. Hurlbut said, you know what? We're going to name him Doctor. That'll get him some respect. He was an early convert to Mormonism. But what's very interesting about him is that he walked right up to Joe, because I guess Joseph Smith actually brought him into the church. And he goes, you know, I'm going to look at this, and if ever I find it to be a fraud, I'm coming after you. I will do everything in my power to tear down Mormonism. So just keep that in your mind. Okay, so here they are, the big three, Rigdon, Cowdery, and Smith. I think somebody did some 18th century or 19th century touch-up on him. Okay, Mormon claims against Spalding. No Rigdon in Pittsburgh before 1822. Spalding died in 1816. Okay, so if Rigdon didn't show up in Pittsburgh until 1822, there's no way that he could have known Spalding. There's no way that he could have known about the manuscript. End of the game. Right there. Boom. Hurlbut started the whole thing as a vendetta against Smith. Now, Hurlbut wasn't the best guy in the world. He had kind of a clouded past before he even joined Mormonism. But it's a matter of public record that he told Smith that he was going to come after him if he thought it was a fraud. So this whole thing about a vendetta, they say that because actually Hurlbut got excommunicated from the church. And that's a story all by itself, but it'll take too long. Rigdon didn't meet Smith before 1830. Again, that's a game stopper, okay? Because if Rigdon didn't meet Smith until 1830, that means that there's no way that he could have participated in the production of the Book of Mormon. So, boom. Finally, only one manuscript, okay, which has been one of the biggest things. What the Mormons like to jump on especially is this one and the first one, okay? Well, you're going to find some interesting information about this. Anyway, now what's also of note with this claim here about only one manuscript, some of the more honest Mormon apologists will actually admit that Spalding's first work, Manuscript Story, was in no way even remotely close to being printable. It was an unfinished manuscript. There were no chapters, nothing. It was just 130 plus pages of stuff that ends abruptly. I think it ends like mid-sentence. Okay? So they'll even admit, yeah, that thing couldn't have been printed.
I take it the book was never published.
Correct. Okay, so now this is, I used to have a different photograph here of just some pages of Manuscript Story, but I wanted to put this one here because, let's see, right in here, if you notice, you have D.P. Hurlbut, okay? That's our illustrious doctor there. It says the writings of Solomon Spalding, proved by Aaron Wright, Oliver Smith, John N. Miller, and others. The testimonies of the above gentlemen are in my in my possession, okay? What is really the truth about Hurlbut's involvement is Hurlbut was the first man to launch an official investigation into Mormonism and the origin of the Book of Mormon, and he was commissioned by a group of gentlemen from Kirtland, Ohio. So their claim that it was purely as a vendetta is just hogwash. So let's go here. Come on. Next page. Sorry, I'm a little rusty. It's been a while. These next two right here. These are very important. These were independent newspaper articles tying Sidney Rigdon to the production of the Book of Mormon. And these came out before any kind of investigation into Mormonism took place. These came from newspaper editors who did their own sleuthing. And especially the 1832 one was done by a man named James Gordon Bennett, who was like public enemy number one as far as the Mormons were concerned in the early to mid 1830s, because he knew the Smiths, he knew a lot about the production, he knew about Oliver Cowdery, okay, and so the stuff that he put into print was absolutely devastating. Multiple witnesses testify that Rigdon and Smith knew each other prior to 1830. Rigdon himself even admits to Mrs. Spaulding that he was connected to the Patterson print shop, where Spaulding took his manuscript in 1814. Hello? This here is a newspaper article talking about our buddy D.P. Hurlbut and the fact that he was getting ready to come forward with his first report. So here it is in the newspapers even, how he was hired by a group of gentlemen in Kirtland, Ohio. Obviously it wasn't just his idea. Okay. Rigdon took the book in 1814. Mr. and Mrs. Spaulding made that claim, and one of Spaulding's friends also made that claim. Joseph Miller Sr.'s testimony. He was one of Spaulding's closest friends. And most of the people who testified in favor of Spaulding's manuscript being the basis for the Book of Mormon mentioned very specific things. He recalled a battle with the Amalekites, one of 14 different peoples mentioned in the Book of Mormon. He also remembered people with red foreheads and the fact that Spaulding wrote his manuscript on something called fool's cap paper. Reddick McKee said he remembered that Spaulding needed a title page. The Pattersons told Spaulding, you need a title page and a couple of other things, as well as the money to cover the cost of your book, and we'll publish it. Reddick McKee also remembered that Spaulding called it manuscript found, that it was written on fool's cap paper, okay? He also made the claim, he's the other one who made the claim that Rigdon stole the manuscript and that Rigdon was an excellent Bible scholar. Matilda Spaulding, Spaulding's widow. There it is, right there. Not quite in black and white, but yeah. So, I mean, he bragged about it, okay? And truth is, he actually supplied leather book bindings to the Patterson print shop. So he was definitely connected at the time that Spaulding was there. Rigdon had family in Amity. Around 1814, Spaulding moved to Amity, and we think it might have been at the suggestion of Sidney Rigdon, because he had family there, including his favorite cousin, Nancy. Rebecca Eichbaum, she was the wife of the postmaster in Pittsburgh, and she regularly saw Sidney, she saw Spaulding, she saw the Patterson brothers, she saw Silas Ingalls, who was the man who actually did the printing at the Patterson print shop. And she also saw a young man who was living with Sidney Rigdon at the time. Not that way, he was like a charge or something like that, with the name of Lambden. And something that she remembers very specifically about Rigdon and Lambden is that oftentimes they would show up at the post office on Sunday afternoons, because the post office was actually open for a couple of hours on Sunday afternoons. Really, really interesting. Well, the Mormons had a field day with Mrs. Eichbaum's testimony, because she gave this testimony when she was in her late 80s. They said, "Oh, her memory, what could she possibly really remember?" Well, in one of her interviews, they asked her about her wedding day. She described her wedding dress to the minutest details. That still wasn't good enough for the Mormons. They said, well, she could have made that up. But here we get this. This was amazing. Such a tremendous discovery. In 1995, what amounted to the last research trip that our editor made back to Pittsburgh, something told him to go back to the Carnegie and go through their newspapers. And here was this newspaper called the Pittsburgh Commonwealth. And he started going through it, and he found some mail waiting lists. If you did not pick up your mail on time, the newspaper published it for 30 days. Okay? And if you didn't pick it up at that point, then the post office would just, dump things into the dead letter file. Well, who do we have right up here? There's Solomon Spaulding's name. Well, yeah, you would expect that. He lived in Pittsburgh, right? What do we have here on this page? Good old Sidney Rigdon. Okay? That was close to a year before Spaulding passed away. So the Mormon claim that Sidney Rigdon was never in Pittsburgh before 1822 got slightly blown out of the water, I would say. Okay, this is something that Spaulding's friends and family just time after time after time, no matter who was interviewing them, said, yes, he did multiple manuscripts. Aaron Wright, who was one of Spaulding's closest friends, said that Spaulding wrote several manuscripts. That manuscript story, which Hurlbut showed to the group, was not manuscript found, because manuscript story was written on a different kind of paper than manuscript found was. He also remembered Indians being descended from the lost tribes of Israel. John Miller said that Spaulding wrote multiple books, one called Manuscript Found. Spaulding spoke about a character named Lehi landing at the Straits of Darien, which is now called Panama. He read Manuscript Found as often as possible. Mrs. Spaulding, she said, my husband read the book to me many times, and I read over 100 pages myself. There was definitely a manuscript found. Spaulding's daughter, she said he wrote a great many books, and she gave actually a partial description. She said this thing was huge, and when she saw it, it was over an inch thick. Well, okay, when I show you, story and found on two different kinds of paper, like I already said. Manuscript story, which was his first attempt, was written on something called quarto. It's essentially a quarter of a page of foolscap, okay? Manuscript story was written on full sheet foolscap. Okay, this is Aaron Wright's, it's from the very first couple of pages of Aaron Wright's copy of the Book of Mormon. And on the right-hand side there, it says, "And I, A. Wright, does hereby certify that he believes it not." He had to, and he says something similar on this side, but it's really kind of garbled. Okay, now, this is to show you visually the difference. This is a page from Manuscript Story, okay? Roughly like 6 by 8. That's a full sheet of foolscap paper, 4 times the size, hence the name quarto, meaning 1/4. There were publications done in quarto. There were publications done in folio, which is a half sheet. There were also publications that came out in octavo, which is an 1/8 sheet. And the Mormons really took issue with us, saying that, this is just splitting hairs. But we went back to that time period, and in our 2005 book, listed out publication after publication after publication where they specified octavo or quarto or folio, whatever. So it was very specific.
It doesn't look like one piece of paper you had on the right there.
Well, it's the binding, okay? Let's see if I can get it back. It's actually, like folded paper. There's a, yeah, it was, those photographs have a really cool story all by themselves. But let me get through the rest of this. Abel Chase, he knew Smith. He was very good friends with Smith. And he saw a stranger named Rigdon. Now, the reason he describes him as a stranger is he didn't know that it was Rigdon until Rigdon actually joined the Mormon Church 3 years later. But he recognized him immediately. He says, "Yeah, I saw this guy all over the place in 1827 at Smith's house." Okay? John Gilbert, he saw Rigdon hanging around the Smith's house when the Book of Mormon was deeply into the production phase, 18 months before the Book of Mormon came out. And he was dead certain that Spalding wrote the foundation of the Book of Mormon. And he said, "No, I have no hesitancy about it." Lorenzo Saunders, he was a character. He didn't even want to make a statement at first. But persistence on the part of different people, he finally came around and he said, "You know what? I remember Sidney Rigdon specifically visiting Joseph Smith in the spring and in the fall of 1827. And in order to solidify it in his mind, he actually remembered other things that happened at those different times that helped him remember that Sidney Rigdon was there. Things like we were all on the front porch eating maple sugar, and Sidney showed up. Well, we went back through agricultural records of that area, and 1827 saw a bumper crop of maple sugar. There you go. And he also said that one of the visits was a year after his father had passed. How many of you have had memories that have helped you because of other things, traumatic things that happened in your life? I still remember my mom's death. I remember she died September 4th, 1994, and I have always remembered it as 9/4/94. And I remember, and that helps me clue in on a whole bunch of other stuff that was going on at the time. So his testimony was really, really solid. James Gordon Bennett, he was the newspaper guy. He was the guy who knew Smith and knew Cowdery and knew Sidney Rigdon later on. And he identified Sidney Rigdon as the ex-parson from Ohio who is the author of the Book of Mormon. And that Sidney Rigdon's translations became the Book of Mormon. This is Sidney Rigdon's grandson. And the Mormons maintain that Sidney never spoke about any involvement, meaning that, their claim he was never involved. Well, according to Sidney's grandson, he said it was an open topic and that the family discussed it a lot. There were no secrets about it whatsoever. That title, I couldn't think of any other way to put it. It's not so recent anymore because this stuff came out like right after our 2005 book, so it's new, but it's old. Okay, so all of those other people on the previous slide put Rigdon at Smith's house. Okay, what's important about this is that this puts Smith at Rigdon's house. So we got him covered both ways, and it was in 1827, 3 years before the Book of Mormon comes out. Okay, now how do we know all of this? Because of a man named George Wilbur, who was a teacher in Bainbridge, Ohio. And he lived practically right next door to Sidney Rigdon, and they became good friends, and they oftentimes had discussions about religion and literature and education and everything. And so he after many visits, Wilbur asked Rigdon about this massive manuscript that was sitting on his table, and every time he asked him about it, all that he could get out of Rigdon was, oh, it's just some theological treatise that I'm working on. And no details whatsoever. Hudson, Ohio Observer. This is a tremendously important newspaper article. And as you can see, it was part of a series. I think there were eventually 10 different articles. What cracks me up about this, it always reminds me, wasn't there some kind of a tune or song, I think back in the late 50s or something, called Mambo Number 4 or something like that. Anyway, what's really important about this, and there it is, as I said earlier, D.P. Hurlbut got excommunicated by the church 1833, okay? And then shortly after that, he went and interviewed Spalding family, Spalding friends, and just garnered a pile of these interviews, okay? And then he got together with, his name escapes me right now, but the editor of the Painesville Telegraph, who eventually came out with a book called Mormonism Unveiled. And that book, Mormonism Unveiled, featured many of the affidavits that Hurlbut garnered. Well, this Hudson, Ohio Observer article came out in between Hurlbut's excommunication, gathering of the affidavits, and before Mormonism Unveiled comes out. Now, the Mormons claim that Hurlbut influenced the testimony of the people that he interviewed. Well, this newspaper article would have given the people interviewed a perfect opportunity to say, you know what we said before? I'm sorry, it wasn't the truth. Hurlbut put words in our mouth. But no, instead, they reaffirmed everything that they told Hurlbut in the many interviews. So what does that do? It validates the witnesses in Conneaut, and it also validates Hurlbut in his actions. So it just, boom, it shuts the door on Mormon objections. Craig Criddle, neat guy. He's an ex-Mormon. Unfortunately, he is an atheist. He and I have had many discussions on this, and he's, I keep him in my prayers Keep him in my prayers. He approached the whole thing from a completely different viewpoint than we did. He used the power of computers to go through Rigdon's style, Spalding's style, words that they both used. There is an abundance of material by Rigdon. As I said earlier in the presentation, he was a traveling preacher, and he just would unleash these fiery sermons, and he had favorite expressions that he would use, and they came up time after time after time. Well, guess what? Some of those same expressions show up time after time after time in the Book of Mormon, as well as Rigdon's take on both Baptist and Campbellite theology. When it comes to Spalding, and this is what's really interesting too, is that their material shows up heavily in the same books. There are 5, as you can see there: 1st Nephi, 2nd Nephi, Mosiah, Alma, and Ether. One of the things that made our first book in '77 such a runaway bestseller, and what generated such animosity towards me and my co-authors, mostly my co-authors. I was more on the editing end of things, and so I was kind of under the radar for the first book. Because when it came out, I got married, I think, like a month or so after that. Anyway, we made the claim that there were some pages to this day that are called the unidentified scribe. And it was our contention that those unidentified scribe pages of the original handwritten version of the Book of Mormon were actually in Spalding's handwriting. And we took 3 different trips up to Salt Lake City with 3 different handwriting experts, and they did side-by-side comparisons. In fact, those photographs, the photograph of the full-size fool's cap that you saw, that was one of those photographs, okay? And the pages, just coincidentally, came from 1st and 2nd Nephi. And there were lots of "it came to pass" in there too. It's interesting how that whole part overlaps. And what Criddle also found was that there were parts where it showed a very strong Oliver Cowdery influence, and 2 or 3 other people who were with Smith from the very beginning through this whole production of the Book of Mormon. And so from the standpoint of computerized textual analysis, his research confirmed the Spalding manuscript as the basis for the Book of Mormon. Now we come to another good ex-Mormon friend of mine, Tom D'Onofrio. This guy, are there any American Revolutionary War nuts out here? People who really have gotten into it? Well, he is. He's one of them. And he's got like a huge library of books on the Revolutionary War. And he was reading Manuscript Story one day, and he goes, "Gosh, that sounds familiar." And so he started jotting down things that sounded familiar to him. And he goes, "Son of a gun, I thought I remembered reading something just like that in the Book of Mormon." And so he started paging through, and sure enough, the exact same phrases were coming through in the Book of Mormon. And so this David Ramsey is not the David Ramsey that you can hear on the radio today, obviously, okay? David Ramsey was George Washington's speech writer, okay? And also his biographer. And so Tom found all kinds of phrases, sometimes whole sentences, that were virtual paraphrases or just carbon copies of phrases that David Ramsey used. Mercy Otis Warren wrote the first detailed chronicle and analysis of the Revolutionary War. And Spalding plagiarized from her as well. And again, the same plagiarisms show up in the Book of Mormon, the exact same ones. Okay? It's just scary. And so you can only come to one of two conclusions. Well, pretty much just one. That they both, either that they both plagiarized from the same sources, or that the Spalding manuscript was just plagiarized by the people who put together the Book of Mormon. Because the exact same ones are in there in pretty much the exact same places, even chronologically. So that, my friends, is pretty much it. And so all three of us, my group and Craig Criddle and his group and Tom D'Onofrio, each, from three different viewpoints, all came to the exact same conclusion. And something about Tom is not afraid to go toe-to-toe with anybody. And he actually took his research to Brigham Young University and got into it with some professors up there. And they had no comeback. They had no comeback. So it's wonderful that all of this stuff. Oh, and someone else from who Spalding plagiarized was a man by the name of James Adair, who wrote History of the American Indians. And that book came out right around the time of the Revolutionary War, 1775. And in that book, he says categorically, the American Indians descended from the lost tribes of Israel. So, I mean, it was a matter of public knowledge and record at the time. They all believed that. So it's so interesting to see that theme first in Spalding's stuff and then coincidentally in the Book of Mormon. So with that, are there any questions?
So when you're talking about the plagiarism, you're talking about the manuscript story.
Actually, yes. Yeah, so even in the prototype book, there are plagiarisms, okay? And those same plagiarisms found their way past manuscript found and into the Book of Mormon. Now, my guess is that they were also in manuscript found, just in a different context. Manuscript story talks about a group of Romans who get blown off course somewhere across the Atlantic and end up at the New World. Manuscript found says that it was 2 or 3 groups of Jews sailing out across the ocean, getting blown off course, and landing down in what we would now call Panama, and those tribes being the ancestors of what we now know as the American Indians.
So there is no manuscript found to look at.
Correct. Correct. And so oftentimes Mormon apologists will say, well, you know what? You show us manuscript found and we'll believe you. To which we say, well, you show us the golden plates and we'll believe you. And about manuscript found, actually manuscript story disappeared for a while, something like 50 years or thereabouts, and was discovered in all places, Hawaii. There was a famous evangelist who was in Ohio and then, I guess in later years, retired to Hawaii. and some people were going through his papers, and they found manuscript story wrapped up in a nice little bundle, and it said on the outside cover, manuscript story, Conneaut Creek. And so, it's like, oh my gosh. And it sent shockwaves through both the Latter-day Saints Church and the Reorganized Latter-day Saints Church, who were the two main organizations at the time. And they both went out to Hawaii and tried to get their hands on it. And some negotiations were finally made, and supervised printings were made. But both of the Mormon printings, whether it's the Latter-day Saints or the Reorganized Latter-day Saints, both took the liberty of changing the title from Manuscript Story to Manuscript Found. And then they showed it to all the faithful, and they said, look, here's Manuscript Found, and it bears absolutely no resemblance to the Book of Mormon. Because what we've seen here, especially from Craig Criddle's research and Tom DeNovero's research, was the plagiarisms that were in Spalding's first manuscript had carried all the way through to the Book of Mormon. So to say that there was no connection, there were no parallels between the two, is a bald-faced lie. But, they maintain what they maintain, and that's it. This was our group up until the end of June 2019. Howard Davis, he was the head of the project for many years. That's yours truly there holding the 2005 book. The fellow just behind me is Wayne Cowdery. He's the one who passed away also in 2019. And then our illustrious editor, Bill Moore. And something that I am very happy to report about Wayne Cowdery is that before he died, a few months before he died, he became a Christian. So we know where he is.
Who's that?
Wayne Cowdery. I'm sorry, you probably couldn't see it from there.
So I got a question.
I'm sorry, this is Wayne Cowdery right here. And, the Mormons, as a footnote to him, the Mormons were really, really upset with him because he was a Cowdery, okay? And related to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery's grandfather is Wayne Cowdery's, I forget how many times, like great uncle or something like that. And we dearly miss him. And so then here are the three books. There was actually a fourth one that only came out on CD, and it was very limited edition, only 300 copies. And the reason we put it out on a CD is because it was over 1,130 pages long. And we knew that no publisher in his right mind was gonna print something like that. So we, and I still have a few of the first copies of that around. But this was our 77 book, and you know what? We are still getting occasional emails from people who left the church because of our book. We know that because that's what they told us in the emails. And so, and then this is, some of you I'm sure are familiar with this. That came out in, okay, so 77, 2005, and 2018.
What's the picture in the middle?
This, it's kind of a stylized picture of manuscript story, the way they found it in Hawaii. And then obviously the silhouette there on the end book is of Joseph Smith, Solomon Spalding. Hush my mouth. And that's it. That's it.
What's your bigger point in this whole thing? Are you trying to say that the Book of Mormon is totally fake and fraud, or that
Well, both. Both. And you know what? There are some Mormon apologists who have actually gone as far as to agree that it was a 19th century production. But they'll but they'll still fall back on Joseph Smith doing it by the gift and power of God. Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting that way. But yeah. And the thing is, our theory has been consistently the most attacked theory, and it's also the oldest non-Mormon theory for the origin of the Book of Mormon, going all the way back to 1832, when one of the first Mormon apostles, Orson Hyde, preached at Solomon Spaulding's church, of all places, and this old guy gets up in the back and he goes, "Oh, come to pass is among us again." And it so rattled Orson Hyde that he blew out of there right away, and for nearly 50 years, no Mormons came to that town. It just, it's like, don't go there. Just don't go there. Yes?
What drew you personally into this subject, get so involved
It was curiosity at first. And if my wife were here, she would say, when Art gets curious about something, he just goes after it. And when my friend Howard Davis told me this, what I believed to be an insane story, I said, I got to be a part of this. I've got to do this. And it wasn't out of animosity. Please. Let me make it perfectly clear to everybody here. We didn't do this out of any animosity towards Mormonism or Mormons. All of us have Mormon friends to this day. And we agree not to talk about this, but we are nevertheless friends. We had no axe to grind, but like Howard was consumed with this at first, because he told me when his college professor told him about it at California Bible College, he goes, "That's got to be the weirdest thing I've ever heard." And so it got him started on it, and then he told me, and I got infected with it, and it's just. But to show you God's sense of humor in all of this, we all decided that we were going to become these incredible apologists, and the first church we were going to work on was Mormonism. And then when we were done with that, we were going to go to Christian Science, and then when we were done with that, we were going to go on to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, 40-some years later, we're still on number one with no end in sight. Now, after looking at the evidence here, some people have asked if we've got the smoking gun. No, we don't have the smoking gun, but the way I like to put it is, we've got several empty cartridges. We're about as close as you can get. And we actually believe that there may be one or more copies of manuscript found, or at least parts of it. We've been trying to chase down the rumors. There was one that it was in an old bookstore in London. That didn't pan out. There have been others that it might be up in upstate New York, which is where Spaulding's daughter lived, because she claimed to have had it in a trunk. And there are stories that said that Joseph Smith actually did work for her for a while, and after Joseph Smith moved on, that the manuscript was gone. There are things that Joseph Smith has alluded to in various conversations that might lead you to believe that he actually had a copy of it himself. We also believe that maybe one of the 4 cornerstones of the Kirtland Temple, which was their first temple, may actually have it along with some other things. When they had finally built the Kirtland Temple in Kirtland, Ohio, they, for 3 of the 4 corners, they had these big ceremonies, big dedication and all kinds of hoopla. And then when they got to the 4th one, there were only like 5 people. Smith, a judge, and I think Cowdery and Rigdon and Pratt, I think. And when they went there, there was no ceremony at all. It was just a few words were said, and then it was stated that Smith took some kind of a book and some other trinkets, put them into that cornerstone, and then it got sealed up. So, in any case, we don't have it right now. Yeah, which is huge, but we do have the first story, and all of the research, like I've shown you up there, shows the deep connection even with that first proto-manuscript and the Book of Mormon. So it clearly has Spalding all over it. So we're still doing our research. The team is very much split up, and I would ask for prayers for Howard Davis because he is under a full court press by the IRS about different things. And the poor man is barely getting by on, I think, 3/4 of his Social Security payment because the IRS has garnished it. Yeah, and then our editor lives out in Apple Valley, and then I'm in Manhattan Beach. So we're kind of scattered to the winds, but you know, we still do things. We're still looking at it. It would be wonderful if we could ever find a manuscript found. That would just be tremendous. Absolutely tremendous.
You got an editor that's Bill?
Pardon me?
You say the editor, isn't that Bill?
That's Bill, yeah.
Apple.
Yes?
Has this, or maybe I should be asking, how has this information been used to reach out to the Mormon population, to educate them about the origins, the underpinnings of
You know,
that faith?
I'm glad you asked that. The Mormons have systematically done everything they can to keep this information from their membership.
Well,
You know,
I'm
and
a
they-
supporter of LHM, and I love their literature, and I love LHM.org/learn.
Let me,
So much information, so many ways, especially now what we have learned with the pandemic, we've been required to utilize
Right.
more social media, and I would think we can do more outreach.
Oh yeah. With our first book, when that came out, the Mormon leadership contracted with a husband and wife team called the Browns, and they published a multi-book series called They Lie in Wait to Deceive. It was full of lies, innuendo, and slander of Howard, of Wayne, of Don, of Walter Martin, everybody who was associated with that project. It's just terrible, and it was just that series of books was disseminated all over the place. When our 2005 book came out, the Mormons knew it was coming out 6 months before it actually came out, and on radio programs and in other ways, free copies of the Browns' They Lie in Wait to Deceive were being disseminated to the public once again to poison the well. But you know what? Once again, God, in his incredible sense of humor, the very first book published by CPH was sold in Provo, Utah. Hallelujah. You know, I mean, that's that's the Brigham Young campus there, you know. And one of their salesmen, boom, you know, it was absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. So just, you know, we've seen the hand of God in this in so many ways. Where I have had success is in the ex-Mormon community. Now, something to tell you about the Spalding theory, and we're not the only ones who believe in it or accept it. There have been other people going all the way back to the 1830s who obviously believed that Spalding wrote the basis for the Book of Mormon. When I say that the Spalding theory is the most attacked, it's not only attacked by Mormons, but it's also attacked by a lot of non-Mormons. In fact, when our 77 book came out, it was hard to tell who was being more critical of it, several different Christian groups or the Mormons. Obviously, we gave the edge to the Mormons on basis of the violence that occurred because we figured none of our Christian brothers were going to go to that extreme. But yeah, to this day, non-Mormons are still highly critical of this. And the reasons that they use, to me, are just so absurd. I mean, you can see the connections. You know, it wasn't a stretch of the imagination to show this stuff. And from multiple directions. Come on, you know. All the way in the back, I saw your hand.
I was just going to ask why Christians were opposed to it.
They seem to be totally sold on the Smith only or Smith plus friends theory for the production of the Book of Mormon. And I mean, you can kind of see it in a way, you know, once they got the Spalding manuscript, Rigdon, Cowdery, and Smith, you know, put together over 3 years, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got the Book of Mormon. Yes?
I think a lot of self-identified Christians are being rather timid, particularly in this time, these days, about being critical of anybody else's faith, because we're so harsh and we're so exclusive and
Okay, I would
have been labeled as
I would agree with you to a
very negative behaviors, and I think we're backing away.
and
from
there are
giving
some,
everybody a lot of
yes.
room.
I mean, if you look back at Dr. Walter Martin, my gosh, he was fire and brimstone, but he was such an incredible intellect when it came to Mormonism. There was a certain point after which no Mormon would debate him. Not even groups of Mormons would debate him, because he had it down so much. But the problem was he was, you know, a real turn or burn type, and if he thought you were an idiot, he would call you an idiot. You know, so he never heard of the word tact. But without him, that first book wouldn't have come out. Okay. And thank God it did, and as well as for the 750,000 copies that got out there. And you can still find it on Amazon, which amazes me. But on the other hand, okay, there are a lot of Christians out there that are reaching out to the Mormons in Christian love. There are a number of ministries. One of them is called Truth and Love Ministries, founded by a former, I believe, Lutheran minister. They're tremendous, an incredible resource, okay? And they have whole courses that you can get on how to reach out to Mormons, to educate you about Mormons, Mormonism, Mormon doctrine, and things like that. The thing is, the Mormons play the victim. They say, oh, why are you picking on us? Why are you saying all these mean things about us? Their idea of the word mean is any criticism, no matter how voiced. And they particularly go after ex-Mormons. Not only with that, but also with, you don't know what you're talking about. Excuse me, I was in the church for 50 years, and I was a bishop, and I was a this, and I was a that. Well, no, you don't know what you're talking about. So there's a lot of like head in the sand sort of things, but they go after ex-Mormons, hammer and tongs, and like I was saying to you beforehand, the Mormons go after anyone who leaves the church in such a way as to ruin them for any other faith. And it is so effective. How effective? Well, let's put it this way. 85% of people who leave the church become atheists or at the best agnostics. Okay? So out of every 100 people who leave, 85 of them are lost.
Well, they're lost anyway.
Right. And again, like I was saying to her, the devil looks at this as a win-win situation. If you become a Mormon, you're his. 85% of you, when you leave Mormonism, you're his. So he just, and so that's why it's so important. I don't think our church and many other churches take Mormonism seriously enough. There are 14 million of them, okay? How many do we have in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church?
2.7.
Okay. We've got our work cut out for us. We really, really do. And the thing is, not only are they out there proselytizing with the largest missionary force of any mainstream religion, they are also getting involved in Christian television, Christian motion pictures, secular documentaries on Christian things. Many years ago, I saw a National Geographic production on Easter. They had some Mormons in there. Hello? Okay. There's a show, I think it's on Netflix right now, called The Chosen. A Mormon is in the number 2, I think, position in the organization that's producing that. They also used Mormon sound studios, Mormon sets. Now, does that necessarily mean that it's being flavored that way? Well, no, not necessarily, but it's got to kind of make you wonder. And we've seen how dialogue is going that way. And I'll tell you one thing right now, the Mormons are pushing harder than they ever have in their history to be considered by all of us as being mainstream Christian. Okay? They are pushing. Now, what they really mean is they are the only true Christians, and that will eventually come out in a conversation if you engage in one with them. But right now, they're just saying, we're Christians. We're Christians just like you. We believe in the same God, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't.
I think they're also trying to, they separate themselves from the word Mormon too. They move more towards,
Yeah, they're demanding that you call them Latter-day Saints now, okay? Which is interesting because in their literature they say call them Mormons. So, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. Yeah, it's really crazy. And the thing is, the reason I'm talking to you folks is that the message that the Mormon Church is putting out there is getting believed by greater and greater numbers of biblical Christians, to where I think around 70 to 80% are saying that Mormonism is a mainstream Christian religion. And of course, it didn't help several years ago when Joel Osteen on national TV said, well, Mormons are Christians just like we are. And then he backed that up by saying, well, but then again, I don't really know much about Mormonism. You know, and it's like, well, if Joel Osteen says it, it's got to be true, right? You know, but the thing is,
They are Christians just like he is.
but you know, I've been, all of us on our team have been getting criticisms from Christians. Why are you picking on the Mormons? Why are you bashing Mormonism? We're not. We're trying to tell you the truth. You know, Mormonism is not Christianity. The Mormon Jesus is the spirit brother of Satan. How much clearer can I be? Their God the Father is the latest in a never-ending succession of God the Fathers, putting it in Joseph Smith's words, well, going as far back as anybody can ever go. And Brigham Young said, well, not only is there a God the Father, but there's also a God the Mother, because everybody knows that if you've got a father, you got to have a mother there too. You know, and please, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it's just they buy this up. Okay, we do not worship. They do not worship the same Jesus, the same God the Father, the same Holy Spirit that we do. They don't. They don't. And they believe that the only way that you get to heaven is by everything you can do. They firmly believe that once you arrive on this earth, God can't do anything for you.
My question here, before somebody marry a Mormon person,
Yeah.
do they tell them that the new person any information about the Mormonism?
Very little, very little. What they do is they use all of the words that at least everybody in this room would recognize as a word that Christians use. They use God the Father, they use Jesus, they use the Holy Ghost, they talk about communion, they talk about baptism, they talk about confirmation, okay? And the list goes on and on and on. And yes, if you ask them if they're saved by grace, guess what they'll say? Yes. Because salvation in Mormonese means something completely different than it does to a Christian. Okay? And in the Mormon theology, whatever, how we start out in heaven in what they call the pre-existence. So there we are in heaven with God. Very cool. But then for some reason, because we're really good in the pre-existence, God says, you know what? I'm going to give you a body. So you can go to earth and you can work your butt off your entire life doing everything perfectly, so that if you do everything perfectly, when you die, you will come right back up to me in what they call eternal progression. And they've softened that now. It used to be that they would boldly claim, yeah, you do all that stuff, and then you can become a god, and you can rule over a planet just like God the Father does. Now they say, you can be just like God. Okay, just like God. What does that mean? And they don't explain that, you know. They also mention the fullness of the gospel. Gosh, that sounds great. What is the fullness of the gospel? It involves the plan of salvation. Okay, what is the plan of salvation? Well, basically that you start off in the pre-existence, you come to earth, and you work your whole life, and you do all these different things. You go through different rituals, and you get and you do this and you do that and you do this and you do that, because God can't do anything for you. And then when you die, if you've done everything perfect, then you'll go right back up to that top heaven and come back to me, and then we'll talk about the whole planet thing afterwards. Okay?
I believe when we date somebody, we have to pray for the truth.
Yes.
Because I dated this Mormon guy, as you're talking all these things, it's been maybe at least 18 years ago. And at that time, I was, and I prayed for the Lord to show me if this is the right person. And over dinner time, after my prayer with the Lord, he professed to me that he doesn't believe in God. And I felt like God is, that's it, that's the end.
I mean, this.
A lot of memories coming back as you're
Sure.
explaining. A lot of people getting deceived.
Oh yeah. Now the
We need to pray for the truth. Lord, show us the truth.
and you never
We're all
hear.
human, and we can all fall, believe in others.
Right. And you never hear about any of this on any of their commercials. Can you imagine what would happen if on one of their commercials they said, well, you do this and you do that and blah, 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 and there's a God the Father and a God the Mother, and there were all these other God the Fathers and God the Mothers going all the way back in time, and the plan of salvation came about at a council of the gods where Jesus and Satan were both invited to lay out their plan before the council of gods, and Jesus' plan was accepted and Satan's wasn't. Wow, big mystery there. And Satan had a hissy fit and rebelled, and because of that, God the Father said, neither you nor your demons nor any of the spirits who rebelled with you in the pre-existence will ever get bodies and ever go to earth. Only the good guys will get to go to earth. Can you imagine if they said that on national TV in one of their commercials? Are you kidding me? No. What do they do instead? Oh, I love it when I can go to my Heavenly Father, and He does this and He does that. And I mean, my gosh, syrup is practically dripping off of their commercials. Or the more recent ones, I am a Mormon. Remember when those came out? It was right at a national election cycle. And they aired especially in red states because Mormons are generally conservative politically. But they would take people, like there was this soccer mom, and all American, pie, the whole bit. Yeah, I'm a soccer mom, and I do this, and I do that, and, and I'm this, and blah, 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 and I am a Mormon. And you're supposed to go like, oh, my gosh.
Looking for a man to pull me through the veils.
It must be, yeah, hello? Because women don't get into heaven except through the man.
That's right.
Yeah.
What is
Hello?
the population of the Mormon today than those days?
Well, there's around 15 million. But Pew Research has been out there in the woods, and they've been discovering a nasty trend that the Mormon leadership are battling hard to combat, which is that more and more Mormons are becoming less and less active, which is kind of counterintuitive because they know if they've gotten far enough along in Mormonism that the only way that they're going to get to the good place is if they really, really work hard. But more and more are becoming complacent. For some reason, the tithing is still going nuts. They're building temples like they're going out of style. But they've lowered the age of missionaries. so that, I mean, practically right out of high school now, you can become a missionary. They're encouraging women to get more actively involved in it. And they're doing everything they can to not only avoid discussing any kind of hard doctrine, but they also make it practically impossible to find any Mormon doctrine on any of their official websites. You have to dig and dig and dig and dig to find it. And they're doing this for a reason. There's something that an ex-Mormon friend of mine told me about 5 years ago, and he called it Mormonism 2.0. And the old guard is still very much in control of Mormonism right now. In fact, a lot of people refer to the Council of 12 as the 12 old men. Because I don't think there's been a young head of the church in a long time. It's because it generally takes you so many years to work your way up through the hierarchy to finally get up into that Council of 12 and then finally become prophet. But there is this movement, and it's a very aggressive movement. It's got aggressive elements in it at any rate, where they're pushing doctrine to the background, and they're trying to put on the facade of like a big box evangelical, okay, to lure more people in. Go, well, gosh, they sound just like so-and-so's church down the street. Thing is, at the core will still be all of the core Mormon beliefs, but they're working and working and working on repackaging the whole thing, and they're waiting, like I said, for the old guard to pass away, because the old guard doesn't want to do it that way. They, Mormonism now and forever sort of thing. And some of the more outspoken old guard have actually even been thrown under the bus for having too extreme views, wanting to push their doctrine out there too overtly. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes, but it's already starting to happen. And so if you couple that with them making their way into Christian productions and trying to influence things, they also get involved in Christian church schools, and they will get involved to such an extent to where there's a bunch of them in that school, and then they will then go to those Christian school boards and start demanding things, that the Book of Mormon be preached right alongside the Bible. And it's even happening in the LCMS. Many years ago, one of the more successful churches down south in San Diego County, they were getting more and more Mormon children in their day school, and some were even becoming members of the church. And at one point, they approached the pastor and demanded that the Book of Mormon be preached from the pulpit right alongside the Bible. And they went to the school board and demanded equal time for Mormonism doctrine there as well. They're getting bold. Sometimes they'll actually wait. Mormon missionaries will actually wait outside of a church on a Sunday morning to proselytize people as they come out of church. Of course, COVID has put a major damper on that. But yeah, it's happening, folks. And so, over the years, I started off initially trying to talk to Mormons about this. And then going back to like 2005, 2006, the Lord directed me more towards the ex-Mormon community. And in 2007, I spoke at the national conference of a group called the Ex-Mormon Foundation. And they had this funny sense of humor. They would hold their national conference the weekend after the Mormons would hold their national conference, as kind of a in-your-face sort of a thing.
And so I gave my very first presentation on Spalding to a group of about 400 ex-Mormons. And there were some very learned individuals in there. There were, like stake presidents, bishops, what they call gospel teachers, former BYU professors. These people knew their stuff, and I was scared witless. But about 10, 15 minutes into the presentation, I made a statement, and I would say probably about 30 or so people gasped in the room. And I went, oh, okay, so they don't know about this. And I was actually, my eyes were opened as to just how well the Mormon Church has kept the Spalding thing a secret, even from people who have left the church. In fact, the last time Mormon missionaries graced my front door, I said, I've got a hypothetical here. What if I were to tell you that, I started off by saying, I really have to hand it to you and your fellow missionaries. If all churches were as energetic in trying to get God's word out to the people as you, it would be a much better place. And they get the big smile on their faces and everything. And I said, that said, let me give you a hypothetical. And I explained the Mormon thing, or the Spalding thing to them. And it's like, whoa, deer caught in the headlights. And in fact, I usually start off by asking them, have you ever heard of a guy named Solomon Spalding? And I am not kidding you. The last time that I was visited by these fellows, the older one of the two said, wasn't he the Nephite shipbuilder who built all the ships for the Nephites to come to the New World? And I said, not quite. So it was an interesting discussion. And it's funny, they know where people like me live. And it's not a conspiracy theory. To this day, I'll see Mormon missionaries walking down the street, on my side of the street. They'll get to my driveway, and they cross the street, okay, and go past, and then continue on their way. I only get visited about once every 15 years. Gosh, you know what? I'm actually due again. It's absolutely amazing, But if you indulge me just a little bit more, what I would like to ask you to do may sound counterintuitive, but if you get a knock on the door and two gentlemen or two young women show up and they're wanting to tell you about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, invite them in if you've got some time. Invite them in and say, you know what? You want to tell me your story? Tell me your story. If I can share my story with you in return. And if they go for it, let them in, sit them down. If you feel like it, offer them some refreshments. Okay? Yeah, no coffee, no Coke. In any case, let them in. Let them tell their story, and then share the truth with them. There is an amazing testimony on this DVD, produced by Lutheran Hour Ministries. A man, what's his name? Micah Wilder. He's part of the Wilder family. The entire family left the church and are now Bible-believing Christians. But guess who started the whole thing? Their son, who went to Florida on his first mission, and He got sent home early, which is bad. It's bad. He called them up and he goes, Mom, Dad, I'm coming home early from my mission and I have something very important to tell you. Well, he went into a home of some Christians and they shared the gospel with him. And it struck fertile ground. And his gospel, his missionary, what do they call him, teacher, supervisor, whatever, in Florida, could see a change had happened with Micah. And he came home, and so he shared the gospel with his family. And they left the church. They all left the church. And it's an incredible story. Just an incredible story. Yes?
What is the relationship between the Mormon church and the Reformed Mormon church?
Okay.
Are they cooperating in some way, or are
Okay.
they enemies?
Joseph Smith was brutally murdered in 1844. They say that he was martyred, but believe me, when you're trying to shoot your way out of a jail, you're not a martyr, okay? We'll just leave it at that. Anyway, when Joseph Smith was murdered, they held a conference to try and decide who was going to be the next leader of the Mormon church. Now, polygamy was rampant at this point. This is 1844, okay? Polygamy was rampant, but there was a huge group within the Mormon church that were very anti-polygamy, okay? And so this was the perfect opportunity for them to get their voice officially heard at this national conference. Well, Joseph Smith, when he was still alive, didn't help matters much. He promised to, I think, no less than 6 different people, including his son, that they were going to be the next prophet after him. And so all of these people come forward, including Sidney Rigdon, and he's so excited. He's like, finally, after 14 years, I can finally become prophet of the church and take it where I want it. Out of the blue, Brigham Young just blows by everybody else, and there's this exchange between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, where Rigdon figures, boy, he's got something big on Brigham Young that's going to ensure that Sidney Rigdon, will be the next prophet. He comes up to Brigham Young and he says, you mess with me and I'll tell my secrets about the church. But Brigham Young was like that with Joseph Smith. He knew everything. And he goes over to Sidney and he goes, Sidney, you do that. You tell your secrets and I'll tell mine. Because he knew that Sidney put together the Book of Mormon. And Sidney just kind of skulked away like a dog with his tail tucked between his legs. Nobody heard from him again, except in 1 or 2 interviews. But Brigham Young then ascended the church and became the next prophet. And so the non-polygamy folks, seeing that, gosh, the second biggest polygamist besides Joseph Smith was now heading the church, they decided to break. And so now you had the Latter-day Saints and what they called the reorganized Latter-day Saints. The reorganized Latter-day Saints church still exists to this day, but I'm going to give you an asterisk here because up until I think about 2010, the reorganized church was one body, but right around there, somewhere between 2005 and 2010, they started de-emphasizing the Book of Mormon. And for the first time in the RLDS history, they elected as president, as prophet, the first person who didn't have Smith for a last name. It had been hierarchical, all the way down up to that point. And the first thing that this guy did was say, don't call me prophet anymore. You call me the president of the church. I am the president of this church. And we are going to start going in a new direction. And so along with that, they changed their name from the Reorganized Latter-day Saints to Community of Christ. Okay? And for a while, it looked like they were going to do everything they could to divest themselves of Mormon dogma and accept Christianity, true biblical Christianity. When a bunch of the faithful saw that it looked like this was the way they were going, they decided to splinter off yet again. And so there is still a group who call themselves the Reorganized Latter-day Saints. It's tiny, because even the Community of Christ, I think, is around 500,000 at most, something like that. And they're headquartered in Independence, Missouri. Unfortunately, the Community of Christ went the New Age route. And so now they're just in some sort of horrible mishmash mix-up between Mormonism and New Age theology. And I found out about this through a good Lutheran pastor friend of mine who had actually been contacted by the Community of Christ leadership. And it just broke his heart. And so those people need prayers every bit as much as the Latter-day Saints, if not more. Yes?
Back in the day when Spalding wrote his manuscript, would you say it was common to have more than one copy of a manuscript?
Yes. As difficult as it was, we believe that there may have been as many as 8 different versions of manuscript found. As far as complete versions, maybe 2 or 3. Okay, one at the printer and one that Spalding had. The thing is, he also had friends of his do editing and spell correct on his stuff. And the thing is, too, he was a poor man, and so it was said by many of his friends that the fool's cap paper that he used, which is, what size is fool's cap paper? Roughly 13 to 14 inches wide by about 15 to 16 inches tall. So, I mean, that's a big sheet of paper. And coincidentally, ledgers in those days were written on full-size sheets of fool's cap.
Legal documents.
Yes. Yeah. And accounting ledgers and everything. And so his friends, Spalding's friends, said that he would, grab, like cast-off sheets, and write as he could to do this. And so, yeah, my group thinks that there weren't any more than about 2 or 3, but Craig Criddle and Tom D'Onofrio, Dale Broadhurst, Byron Marchant, I know these names. Probably only 2 of them are going to mean anything to you because of the slideshow, but I have a lot of friends out there who think that there may be as many as, or may have been as many as 8. Because, 2 at least, one that the printer had, one that Spalding had, perhaps another one, which would make 3 for people who helped with the editing. Then when Rigdon stole the manuscript, he made a copy, so that would have been 4 right there, okay? And then later on, as he started redoing things and taking Spalding stuff and blending it in with other things to make the Book of Mormon, there could have been additional, like, proto books that were, part Spalding, part this new stuff. We tend to believe that there weren't any more than 3 or 4, but Criddle, Broadhurst, Marchant, Hawley, a whole list of others think that there may have been as many as 8. But even 2, if we could find one of them. Also, early on in the production of the Book of Mormon, right when Smith had about 116 pages, Martin Harris, who was the scribe at the time, was getting pestered by his wife. Martin Harris was not a very bright man. He was an honest farmer, and he thought something really big was going to happen and that he was going to be able to really cash in. His wife said, "You're nuts, but I'll go along with it for now." But then, after so many months had passed and there was a sizable chunk of the book, she kept pestering him. "Martin, I'm not going to let you supply Smith with any more money. I need to see this. I want to see this. I want to see what's going on." Harris went to Smith. Smith said, "Oh, you of little faith. Of course it's of God. I'm telling you it's of God. It's got to be of God." "Yeah, but my wife. Yeah, but my wife." Anyway, make a long story only slightly longer, Harris figured out a way to take those 116 pages home, and the story that the Mormons put out is that Harris's wife, after looking through them and showing them to a couple of people who she believed would be good judges of the authenticity, the Mormons claim that Harris's wife took those 116 pages and lit the fireplace with them.
That's how authentic they were.
Yeah, and so Smith, so Harris went back to Smith, and the story was also that Harris's wife said, "Well, if it's truly from God, God can just talk to Smith again and recreate those 116 pages." Well, we knew where they were really coming from. They were taking Spaulding's manuscript and kind of ad-libbing with other stuff as they were going along to make those 116 pages. But Smith, never to be outfoxed, said, "I've gotten a revelation from God." And he said, "Because you people did what you did with those 116 pages, those will never be retranslated until a short time before I come back." And they believed it. They believed it. It's just like there was a time when Joseph Smith supposedly had the golden plates in a wagon, and they were covered up with a cloth. And he walked into a bar. Sounds like a good joke. A Mormon walked into a bar. They didn't always have the ban on alcohol, okay? They didn't. But in any case, he walks into a bar, and a couple of guys said, "What's under the cloth, Joe?" And he says, "Well, those are the golden plates. But you can't look at them because God will punish you if you do." And after they'd had a couple, he went off to the men's room or whatever. And of course, as soon as Smith left, they lifted up the sheet, and it was nothing but a bunch of bricks. And so as soon as Smith comes back, they confronted him. They said, "Joe, it's nothing but a bunch of bricks." Without skipping a beat, he goes, "Of course they're a bunch of bricks. God knew you were going to lift that sheet, and he turned them into a bunch of bricks." And they let him off. They let him off. It's so amazing. I mean, there was a time when Smith and Rigdon actually did get caught, and they were both Sidney Rigdon was almost killed. They went to a small town, and I see it's almost time for the heavy tools to begin, so I'll make it as short as possible. They went to some town by a river, and they were trying. It was when they were trying to proselytize real heavily with Smith and Rigdon. It was the road show featuring Smith and Rigdon, and they went to this town, and they had them all meet down by the river, and they said, "Tomorrow we are going to show you that we are truly of God, tomorrow at, I'll say noon, we're going to walk out on the water of the river and show you that we are men of God. See you tomorrow. So everybody leaves, or so Smith and Rigdon thought. Immediately, they and a couple of other people with them started putting rocks in the water just underneath the surface, okay? Making like a path that went out for a ways and then to the side, with the thought that, the next day, Smith and Rigdon would just walk along that rock path, and it would look like they were walking on water. Problem was, there were some young men in the bushes who were suspicious about things, and after Smith and Rigdon and their crew left, these guys went out to the deeper part and removed all the rocks. And so they're going along, and everything is wonderful, and people are like, ooh, ah, wow, and all of a sudden, down in the water, Smith and Rigdon ended up getting tarred and feathered, and Rigdon was basically hospitalized for a while because it was hot tar, right? And he wasn't of the same health or as young as Smith. It almost caught up with them, but last point I want to make specifically about Spalding, though, just think about this. If Spalding had been able to raise the amount of capital necessary to publish his book, there may very well never have been a Book of Mormon. And it's not just our feeling. Other people have voiced that same thought over the years. So pray for the Mormons. Invite them into your homes. Share the gospel with them. Share it in love, okay? And just let the Holy Spirit do his work. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.